ready. We need to clean and dress her wounds as soon as possible." The nurses quickly began to move. Edward passed by Alice without noticing her, as his mind was already focused on the surgical plan. What to start with, what could wait. His colleague was right, though, patients like this rarely survived. Their bodies were often too weak. Edward entered the operating room, deciding to start with the open fracture in her leg. But as soon as he prepared himself, his gaze fell on the woman's hip, where there was a scar in the shape of a star, an old, large scar. "Olga," he muttered. He studied her face closely. The anesthesiologist began to worry. "Edward, is everything all right?" Edward swallowed hard and nodded. "Yes, continue." Alice couldn't bring herself to leave the hospital. Her father had fallen asleep long ago. But she was still there. Finally, she left and approached the nurse. "Sveta, do you know if the surgery is over?" Sveta's eyes widened. "You can't imagine. They say the old woman's situation is so bad that there's no point in continuing, but Edward Sergeyevich said she's going to live. Another doctor has already arrived to help. We're all hoping for the best. She's homeless, but he's fighting for her like she's family." Sveta barely finished her sentence when Edward entered the hallway with another doctor in a white coat, likely the second surgeon. He smiled at her and said, "Edward Sergeyevich, this woman will live for at least another 100 years. She survived such a surgery." Edward smiled back. "Maybe not 100 years, but she's definitely going to live." Alice sighed with relief. "That's a relief. Everything will be okay." She realized she had never doubted it for a second. A few days later, Edward came to check on Alice's father as they were preparing to discharge him. "How are you feeling?" he asked. The man smiled in response. "I'm good, they even feed me on schedule. How can I relax with my daughter here?" Edward quickly glanced at Alice. "That's great. You should listen to your daughter." Alice stepped closer. "Edward Sergeyevich, how's the old woman?" "Thanks, she's better. She's eating on her own. She'll be running around soon." Alice couldn't help but smile. "You're amazing." Edward looked at her in surprise, then smiled back. "Would you like to meet her?" "Sure, is that possible?" He nodded and left the room. Alice followed him, and when they entered, the elderly woman turned to them with a smile. "Edward," she said warmly. Alice looked at him, stunned. His face, previously serious and focused, softened, and he gave her a kind smile. "Hello, Olga. How are you feeling?" Alice understood everything at that moment. It was clear to her now. "It can't be," Edward smiled at her. "It can be. Although, if you'd asked me before, I would have said something like this never happens." Olga's son had taken her away to another city to sell her apartment. Once the money ran out, he kicked her out. She was too embarrassed to ask her old colleagues for help, so she went back to the orphanage where she had worked. But by then, the entire staff had changed, and they refused her, saying they had enough children of their own. That's how she ended up on the street. Alice wiped away tears. How can someone do that? She's family. They spent a while with Olga, and then Alice stood up. "I'll go. I need to get my father ready for discharge. Do you mind if I visit you again?" Olga just smiled and answered, "No, we don't mind." As Alice left, Olga turned to Edward, watching him carefully. "Edward, I think that girl feels something more for you than just gratitude." Edward blushed. You think so? She raised an eyebrow. You really are a slow learner. How long are you going to hide from each other? Edward blinked, confused. What hiding? Olga gave him a pointed look. I've been waiting for this for 10 years, and you've been hiding for longer. What are you afraid of? He looked at her, and a small spark of hope kindled in his heart. Do you really think 10 years is too long for love? Edward shrugged. I don't think I'm of any interest to her. Olga closed her eyes and muttered, one genius, and one fool. Edward scoffed, slightly offended. Since childhood, he knew Olga always said what she thought, and he tried to follow her example. But now, it felt uncomfortable, especially regarding Alice. 2 days later, when he entered Olga's room, he was lost in thought. For a moment, he imagined hugging her. Hello, Alice, he said. She jumped up and blushed. Hello, I came to visit Olga and brought something tasty, Alice said. We're also looking for a nursing home, Edward replied. A nursing home? Alice looked at him in surprise. She can't go back to the street, he added, stepping closer to Alice and taking some books from her. Where did you get these? He asked, holding the books, which she had been preparing for the nursing home. He threw the books into the trash can with force. I don't want to see or hear about anyone being sent to a nursing home. I have a big apartment. End of discussion. He stormed out of the room, and Alice noticed that Olga was crying. She quickly rushed after Edward Sergeyevich. She called. He stopped and looked at her. You're the most wonderful person I've ever met. He finally looked at her and asked, Alice, how old are you? Her eyes widened in surprise. 30, he smiled. I'm 41. Would you like to go on a date with me? Alice gasped, then smiled. Yes. I'll go, but I should warn you, I don't have the best character. Alice smiled even wider. You don't know what kind of character I have either. Edward looked at her seriously. As you understand, I have Olga, and she may never learn to walk again. Alice squinted. I have a tail in the form of my father. I think they'll get along fine. Then she laughed. Edward, you're inviting me on a date, and then you start talking me out of it. He smiled sheepishly. I'm just wondering why someone as beautiful and young as you would want to date an old, crazy doctor. Alice took his hand. Maybe it's because I can't imagine my